asking people for donations, if it's successful, solves one of the biggest problems we have in the movement. Estimates are that our movement for ending factory farming has about less than $300 million globally, which means that we have about as much money roughly as McDonald's makes in a week of profits to spend to help 80 billion land animals, trillions of crustaceans and fish as well, which is obviously nowhere near enough money. The ASPCA alone has more money than we do. So this is a real kind of David and Goliath fight. In fact, the meat industry is worth $2 trillion, which means that if it was David and Goliath, because we're nerds and we worked this out, Goliaths would be so tall that the Earth's atmosphere would reach up to about his belly button. That's the kind of scale difference between the animal movement and the meat industry here.
There are never-ending conversations in the animal advocacy movement about whether diet change is an effective ask for the public. Today, we speak with Thom from FarmKind on why he thinks asking people to donate, rather than change their diets, can be a much more promising approach. We speak about why behavior change is particularly difficult, the many benefits of donating, what other social movements have used as their ask, as well as the many different experiments FarmKind has run in their quest to figure out how to best raise funds for animal advocacy. Without further ado, hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hey everyone, today we are joined by Thom Norman, who's the co-founder of FarmKind, a nonprofit that helps people support effective charities working to end factory farming. A former nuclear energy lawyer, Thom shifted careers after recognizing the urgent need to address animal suffering and create pathways for everyone to contribute to solutions. So welcome, Thom.
Thank you for having me.
First things first, what is something you changed your mind on recently and why?
So recently I've been going on a bit of a journey around AI in the animal space, especially questions like precision livestock farming. We have these short-term problems. We've got factory farming right now that we need to deal with. This seems a bit speculative, but I think increasingly both coming to believe that the change is going to happen very quickly, as with AI changing so many things in the economy, but also that there is maybe a possibility that this could actually be good for animals too. So I think it's a really interesting, fast-moving part of our movement that I think we, in general, as people who care about animals and their suffering, certainly need to be paying a lot of attention to and making sure that we try as best we can to make it go well.
I'm always not fully sure what people mean when they say precision livestock farming. Can you just expand exactly what that means and what we mean by it going well and what that may look like for animals?
What we mean is using artificial intelligence and monitoring software, so this could be cameras or monitoring devices put onto animals, to really precisely understand what's going on with the animal. And this allows you, on the kind of the negative side, to be really precise about controlling the food that the animals get and things like this. So you can really control the inputs, only give them as much as they need in order for you, for example, to produce your products as easily as possible. But on the plus side, you could use these kinds of technologies to, for example, pick up on diseases much more quickly, and so identify early on when animals are becoming ill and help them out much more quickly. It could help you with other kinds of signs of distress or suffering in animals, and then allow you to use potentially automations and robotics or have human interventions that can then come in and solve these problems. So it could be good because it could allow. There are reasons why farms might also want to prevent diseases, for example, in their animals, but it also could be bad in that it just makes farming way more efficient, and so more animals are produced, or that it reduces, for example, the amount that they need to feed animals. So the animals are growing, but they're always hungry or something like this.
But it seems like from what you said at the very beginning that actually you become a bit more optimistic on this. Maybe you want to expand on that particular thing?
Yeah, I think optimistic from a really low base. Okay. I still think probably this will be bad. But I've spoken to a few people in the movement who are paying a lot more attention to this. The Shrimp Welfare Project guys, for example, who are kind of excited. And I at least think that it's possible that this will go well. I'm a pessimist by nature, I think. So,
well, yeah, it's good to, even if you're overall negative, to maybe be. I still have some shift in opinion or some calibration towards some of what other people think. Is it still useful? Nice. For sure. Well, we will not be talking about precision livestock farming today, although obviously could be a very interesting topic for another conversation. No, but we're going to talk about somewhat of the work FarmKind does, but also maybe more broadly is what should we be asking for as animal advocates? Like what should we be asking kind of the public or people we talk to, people who are interested in our issue, what should they be doing when they kind of engage with our issue? And so one thesis I've heard you outline before is behavior change is not a good ask. We should not be asking people to necessarily, give up meat totally, go vegan. Do you want to expand on why you think that's the case?
The kind of way I like to think about this is, in some sense, our campaign to end factory farming should be easy because actually most people already agree with us. So about 75% of Americans in polls think that factory farming is bad. They really don't like the way animals are treated. 50% or just under 50% of people say that they want a total ban on factory farming. We have this widespread support across this, party political lines, all this kind of stuff. And yet, actually, we're obviously the problem is getting way worse, not better, globally speaking. And I think part of this is because we are just really not doing a very good job of turning these people who agree with us into active supporters of our goals and our mission. And I think a big part of that is that the perception, certainly for many people, is that what they're supposed to do, the only way that they can help is to change their diet. And I think that there is some evidence now that this is actually not only sort of switches people off, but it also actively can turn them from supporters into antagonists. So in some cases,
Do you want to touch on that evidence? What have you seen that makes you think actually the behavior change avenue isn't the best one?
there are two kind of things here. There's asking people to change their diet makes them feel more powerless, and it can also increase their resistance. So on powerlessness, basically the way that many people think about the food system is through their interaction with the food system. So this happens like, anytime you engage with a complicated system a lot, you kind of think you understand it, even though you just engage with it. So the silly analogy I've used is like the toilet. I think it's easy to think how a toilet works because you use it every day. Or at least I hope you do. and but like actually I could not explain to you how a toilet works. And there's like fascinating studies where people are asked to draw bicycles and they have like the chain like connected to like the front wheels or like just like nothing. It doesn't make sense because people see these things all the time, but they don't understand how these systems work. And the food system is like this. Like we go to the shops all the time, we think we understand how food is produced, but obviously we only see the shops. And what this does is it makes people think that food is like the only mechanisms for affecting the food system are something to do with buying food in the shops. So in other words, like changing what you're buying, like a boycott, going vegan. And then they say, well, nobody else is going to do that, like, because they all like meat and they all eat. So even if I change what I'm eating, I kind of get all the costs of changing. I have to, work out how to cook new things, don't get to eat some of my favorite foods. And nothing is going to change because nobody else is going to change what they're doing. So people feel powerless. They feel like there's nothing they can do. And an organization, Pax Fauna, did some great focus grouping and surveys on this, and kind of pulled out some of these trends. And then the other piece that I mentioned is kind of this resistance, which comes from the meat paradox, which I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with, which is this kind of cognitive dissonance that's created when we think about both caring about animals and thinking that factory farming is bad and want to eat the products. And the easiest way to resolve the meat paradox for somebody is simply to start actually pretending that like factory farming is not a problem, or saying to themselves factory farming is not a problem. They can avoid the issue. They can explain why it doesn't actually happen or why it's not so bad really. And this actually then motivates them to stop agreeing with us and to find reasons why we're wrong, because it's the easiest way for them to resolve this cognitive dissonance in their mind.
I'm always kind of skeptical of using things like, oh, many people agree with us. These polls say 70% of people want to end factory farming. It's like when you really like kind of dig down and actually like explain to them exactly what that means. It's like, okay, your meat will actually increase in price by like 80%, and we'll have way less animals, and farmers will maybe go out of business, all this kind of stuff. Suddenly that number drops rapidly. And I think Rethink Parties has one survey where they did kind of like elucidate this a bunch more, and the support number was now more like 20% rather than like 50 or 70. So I guess part of me is like, do we actually have that much support? I'm actually not sure about this. I think maybe for some things like banning the worst practices, but if it's actually like, saying that we should kind of end factory farming. I'm actually not that sure. I guess, do you have any thoughts on that, or like, and what do you
Yeah.
think is like even relevant to, I guess, what you're proposing?
I agree with you that 75% or these any survey number, there's always a big difference between what people say they'll do and what they actually want and what they actually will do in practice, right? What I do think is it's indicative of the fact that people agree, at least in principle, with a lot of, and that their intuitions and their values are very pretty well aligned with ours. And I think even at these lower numbers, like 20% and things like that, this is like a sea change amount of number of people,
Yeah,
right? And so even let's say it was about 20% of people who are really on board, that's still enough to really start to change the culture and to really start to create change. I also think that it depends on how you explain the food system. So Pax Fauna have done some, again, in the same research, talking to people about framing things in terms of evolving the food system and the way that we develop the food system. So factory farming solved a problem in the past in terms of producing cheap meat that people wanted to eat and lowering the cost of meat. And the need is not to go back to some past, but to evolve the food system to the future with, for example, new ways of producing foods like cultivated meats and these sorts of things that can create a new food system that's both sort of sustainable for the planet and also produces food that people like. And I think it also depends on like how we frame this and how we talk to
yeah,
people about these things, and this will change how engaged people are.
yeah. I mean, I agree that 20% is still major, and that's, about 20 times the number of vegans we currently have in like the UK and
Yeah.
in the US and Europe. So yeah, a huge change. Do you think a solution to this is possible through just asking for more mild behavior change? I think, one common thing that used to happen a lot is, everyone should go vegan. I think most people are like, okay, like you said, it's actually quite a hard thing to change everything you eat 3 days, 3 times a day, and change your food, your clothes, and everything else. So maybe we should just ask people to, be a reducitarian. It's like eat vegetables, like, or have a vegetarian meal like most nights of your week, etc., etc. Do you think that's a better solution?
So firstly, to say, just to be really clear, I know you know this, but I'm not saying that going vegan doesn't work for anybody, right? Like clearly
Yeah,
there are
yeah,
some people for whom it does. It's just that when we look at the literature, it seems that there are some groups who are completely resistant to this and different, it probably has a fairly small market, right? And I think reducitarianism is also going to be attractive to some number of people. It is helpful, and I think it has a wider appeal, but it still falls foul of those kind of psychological mechanisms I was talking about, because it still has people thinking in terms of this kind of like the frame of the boycott or the frame of
yeah,
the shop, and not sort of envisioning in their mind changing the system overall. And so I think it still can fall foul of people feeling ultimate powerlessness, or ultimately that we can't actually make change because all I'm doing is buying a bit less meat. How can that make a difference in such a massive
mm,
system? And so I think reframing people's way of approaching this from, it's on you as a consumer to change how you behave, to the system needs to change. And actually, you can play a role in helping to make that system change. I think is an important kind of reframing of the picture that just
yeah,
more mild diet change asks don't actually get us to.
yeah, yeah. It makes sense because obviously you are, a former lawyer in the government department for, I guess, net zero, and I guess like there's an interesting climate example here where it's like, actually the climate movement for a long time did actually talk about things like you should recycle, and do
Mm.
your food waste, and don't use plastic straws and all this kind of stuff. And the big diet change message is the problem of like, maybe we both think it's not the best, the most effective ask, and it's very hard, whereas like
Mm.
recycling is, not that effective. It's kind of easy. So like, why do you think the climate movement, maybe they kind of have spoken about personal diet, personal decisions, like in like lifestyle decisions, and that seems to have not been a huge detriment to their success?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess there's two things. One, actually, when you look at surveys of what people are prepared to do for the climate, changing their diet ranks like always at the far bottom. So
Yeah,
there
yeah,
might just be
yeah,
something specifically about this ask. And whether you have a plastic straw or a paper straw is sort of maybe it's a mild inconvenience when you're being asked to give up, the foods that you have maybe incredibly fond memories of that you remember, like Christmas dinner or all this kind of thing. Like many
yeah,
men relate eating meat to their masculinity. Like this is pulling on more fundamental parts of our identity than how
yeah,
we
yeah.
drink our iced lattes or whatever.
You've given yourself away, Tom. The ice
Yeah,
lattes.
maybe I should have picked my ice cold beers instead or something.
Something manly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But then I think the other component is I think actually climate movement is also, I think it seems to me from very much from the outside, but realizing that maybe focusing so much on individual change is also a strategic mistake, and that we need to be thinking at the higher level, because obviously, in terms of climate, individual change is not what it ultimately is going to solve our climate problems. It is going to have to come at the level of like government investment in producing cheap energy and things like this. And so, actually, you do need to address these questions at that higher level of the system. Individual people can be part of that, but trying to put it on their shoulders to be the change is both, I think, an inaccurate framing of the problem and also a hard sell.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, in climate terms, it doesn't seem to be the best way to fix climate changes. We're getting people to recycle, but in the animal world, it's much more common. You'll hear like pushback from media or like various influencers be like, "Oh, these vegans like they're moralizing, telling you what to eat." Whereas on the environmental side, actually, you don't hear that. But yeah, it's more like oh, actually, it's like net zero is driving up the cost of energy and like taking away jobs. So yeah, it's like some like interesting different critique. But anyway, we don't have to dwell on this. Let's say people are listening to this, and I think many people probably have either come to similar realizations or at least, had similar thoughts about like what should we be asking people to do. And I guess, what do you think is a good alternative?
At FarmKind, the kind of alternative that we are putting forward is just incredibly simple, and it's donating to charities that are doing a really good job on working on changing the system. So we built a thing called the Compassion Calculator, which allows people who are non-vegans to basically put in what they eat on a regular basis, and we will say, okay, if you want to do just as much good as going vegan, you can donate this amount. For the average omnivore, that's about $23 a month, and you can help animals as much as you would were you to completely change your diet. And kind of the most obvious reasons why this is good is, from the movement point of view, is you can only not eat the animals you are otherwise going to eat, but you can donate functionally in as much money as you have, right? So you can help a lot more animals potentially by donating than you could even by changing your diet. And secondly, as a movement, we have a massive funding problem, which maybe we can talk about in a little bit. But then from the point of view of the individual who's sort of being presented with this option, it's really easy. Setting up a direct debit for a small amount of money that's affordable to you. You can do it once and then forget about it and go around the rest of your life and just be stacking up your impact for animals as you go along, right? And then it is also actually really, really effective. We know that some charities doing amazing work for animals. They are for really tiny amounts of money, preventing a huge amount of suffering and doing a lot to help us to evolve to this new food system. And so it really is actually making a massive difference.
I guess the basic idea is, if you stop eating animals and you go vegan, a normal omnivore eats roughly like 200 animals a year, all in, including like fish and kind of small aquatic animals. So then, if you stop doing that, maximally you're kind of averting maybe 200 animals. But, some charities, I'll just name drop Shrimp Welfare Project, I think by their own calculations, they can not save the lives of, but like reduce the suffering of around 1,000 shrimp per dollar. So it's like, actually, just by giving $10, you're like orders of magnitude, it's doing better than your diet change. And I guess, is that kind of the main thesis driving, I guess, the compassion calculator, and like, yeah, what people can achieve with more than just a diet?
Yeah, I think so. I think fundamentally it allows us, if you like, to massively scale up our impact with animals way more than we can by just changing our diets.
Yeah, and maybe one thing, I assume you don't, something you mentioned to me, I don't know if you publicize this too much, is like, it's not just something for people who are not currently vegan or vegetarian to do to offset the diet. In fact, it's people who are currently also following a plant-based diet. One framing you said is like, you can offset your past whatever years of non vegetarian or veganism, or you can just give, because that's good as well, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, how much do you push those two angles, and how's that reception been?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We're not trying to sell people don't go vegan. We're trying to say this is an alternative, right? And you can do both at the same time. I do both. I give, and I also am a vegan. We had a donor, for example, who got into an argument with their family over Christmas about the way animals are treated, and so decided to donate the money she was given for Christmas to farmed animals, almost to sort of to spite her recalcitrant family members, right? So there's all kinds of different reasons you can donate. You can offset your friends and family. You can offset your past self. You could simply just do it to increase the amount of good you can do for animals. So yeah, this can be for everyone. And I think that one of the reasons that you mentioned before that often veganism can be perceived as moralizing, and I think part of the reason for that is I was looking at a recent literature review, and they identified this kind of like when you are perceived to be reducing people's autonomy and agency by telling them what to do, this kind of creates a backlash effect where like, I don't want to do that. And I
Mm.
think that possibly because it's this, we have this one message of like, unlike with climate change where you can drive less, you could change your straws, you can recycle. There's actually quite a lot of different things you can do to help the environment. We're like saying this one thing. It's more like we're telling people what to do and actually opening up the options. So even if you see donating as an alternative way to do good and to help animals, I think it just also maybe helps with this thing about like being perceived as telling people what to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I do agree that predominantly it's been one thing, it's like change or die. But actually, I think most of us right now agree that there's a plethora of things, which is you can donate, you can volunteer for a group, you can
Yeah.
go find a job. And there are actually many things that we haven't been talking about historically, which I think you're definitely right in that, no one likes being told what to do. And if you only present one option, that is functionally.
Yeah.
And do you have any interesting kind of anecdotes or case studies of, I guess, your work or the reception to this compassion calculator in practice? Like, do people just hear about it and go, "Oh, finally, like I didn't want to, I couldn't change my behavior, but this is exactly like now I can get engaged in some way."
So we had one. I was talking to one person at the weekend actually, who their partner, they had kids recently. They wanted to go vegan and tried to go vegan several times, but for various sort of health reasons, their doctors have been like, "You can't. You should stop doing this." Especially when they had kids, the doctors were telling them, you really need to start eating some animal products. And like, who knows if the doctors were right or not? I obviously can't
Yeah.
can't say, but that's the when your doctors are telling you to do that. Unsurprisingly, you take their advice. That seems broadly sensible to me. They were saying that this is perfect because I've always felt I've always engaged with this issue and always wanted to do something, but had kind of written off diet change as just not possible, at least for them.
Mm.
And so that I think is exactly the kind of person for whom this approach, and particularly this kind of like framing it as an offsetting, I think really works because it directly links the idea of like your values, the thing that you're feeling kind of bad about right now, maybe, which is
Mm.
the fact that you're continuing to eat these animal products that don't accord with your values, with a solution.
I think the offset is an interesting one because I think you could, I think, definitely make arguments saying, the donation is also like a foot in the door mechanism, such that you start doing one positive thing for animals, and then maybe over time that grows, and you, like I said, maybe you volunteer, you get a job, and maybe in the end you actually do change your diet. And this was like kind of the first step in the journey. But then in some ways, I think, but maybe we shouldn't be expecting that as the end goal for all the reasons we said. And so I guess I'm kind of torn on like whether it's good to think about it in like a foot in the door, or actually no. Then my mind's still too focused on diet change, and I should be a bit more like open minded.
So I think it's possible. Like the mechanism is definitely possible that like your actions can follow your beliefs, but your beliefs can follow your actions, right? So it could be that once you start doing things that a person who cares about animals would do, like donating, that this reinforces that part of your identity and makes you want to do more things. But I think it is really important in this that we don't simply that this asking of people to donate doesn't simply become just a cheeky new way of trying to get them to change their diet. Like
Yeah,
we have to really mean this, right? Like
yeah,
if we're going to get people to believe that what we're saying is like there are multiple ways to help and they're all equally legitimate, we have to actually internalize that and not say things like I don't know, if someone was vegan and they stopped being vegan, that they never really cared about the animals, for example, or these kinds of
yeah.
things where we sort of deify almost diet change as like this special thing and really actually say like, look, however you're helping animals, if you are helping, then that is what counts.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I think of other social movements, I can't recall that many examples. Obviously, I haven't been involved with all of them, but can't think of that many examples where the donation ask is very kind of forefront. And obviously, the effective altruism movement is a key one. But I think of climate, and I think it's like, I see it mentioned somewhat. It's not a huge thing, but it's not like a front and center kind of like, this is what we really want. I guess, I guess, how do you kind of square that with, I guess, what I see your view is, yeah, you're not saying that should be the main thing, but it should be like a prominent option in terms of how people can help.
Yeah, I think so. And I think like you kind of said before, like for some people changing their career, both of us are working in this space, right? Like that's one of the ways that we're trying to help is by dedicating our career. Other people volunteer regularly. But the thing is, in any of these social movements, actually, like people generously donating do sit behind the movement, because no social movement can run without resources. And in the history books, maybe those aren't the people who get kind of written about. It's the people who are on the barricades, or doing the speeches, or advocating in parliament, or whatever it is. But actually, the people who are providing the money to allow this work to happen are an incredibly crucial part of every social movement.
I agree, and I agree. Yeah, that maybe that bit isn't written about. I think I always think of a funny example. There's a famous group called Otpor who overthrew the Serbian dictator in 1999, and there's a good documentary about them. But there's a very blasé statement halfway through the documentary saying, "Oh, how are you funded?" And they said, "Oh, we got $20 million from the CIA." It's funny both for like the geopolitical reasons, but it's like, oh, actually, what you think is like incredibly scrappy, kind of inspiring, kind of like a radical punky anarchist group in like Serbia is actually also like a very well funded group
Yeah.
by the American government. But anyway, do you have any sense of like to what extent we should be trying to unify our asks as a movement, or do you think it's the groups doing political advocacy should just focus on political actions, and the groups doing donations should focus on donations, and like that's the kind of the healthy way this cookie crumbles?
I think broadly, yes. And like obviously, often when we're kind of talking about like what should the animal movement do or something, we kind of imagine that we have some sort of way of like getting everyone to go together and do the same,
Coordinate.
which
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
which obviously is just untrue. Like all sorts of different people will come in with their own theories of change and their ideas. And I think this is good because actually none of us really know the answer. We're all trying to work it out, making some guesses and some assumptions, and testing things right. And so it makes sense to want a broad range of approaches going on at once, so we can maximize the chance that we get the right ones. That being said, I think we have to also be aware that we have a brand collectively out in the world, and we might internally understand the differences between all the different groups and their sort of how they sit on the spectrum of different approaches to animal welfare. But from the outside, everyone just sees us as kind of like the crazy vegans or
Yeah,
whatever it
yeah.
is, right? And so I think we do want to think carefully. If you're doing things that are very sort of forthright campaigning around diet change, I think you want to consider how that's coming across and maybe how that is affecting the general public's perception of the broader movement, and whether that is actually overall a positive thing to be doing.
I guess, have you guys had much success, or do you think there are many good role models for, I guess, the kind of thing you're advocating for? Is people who kind of care deeply about animals, but not necessarily changing their diets in the most drastic ways, but are maybe giving good amounts of money to help animals? I guess like, do you think there's a possibility that we can kind of change the narrative that's kind of out there of like, yes, the crazy radical vegans being something a bit more moderate and maybe includes the kind of stuff you're asking for?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't think it's just us who are saying this, questioning
Yeah.
this kind of like go vegan message, right? I think there's a wider movement within animal space to think, okay, we need to think about this more, and people are producing reports and things on this question, thinking maybe we need to sort of have a strategic shift. In terms of the impact, I think we can look at sort of maybe like the aid movement is like a really good example, right? Where like actually that is most people's connection to helping people in foreign countries. And you can point to amazing things that people's money has done, and the ways that it's saved many lives. I mean, right now, actually, with the aid cuts, many people are exactly making this argument, right? Like how vital our money is in saving lives and things like this.
Yeah.
So I think you clearly can get people to think about donations and money as a really integral way that we help make good things happen in the world.
There's clear reasons why we think that this is an easier ask to make of people, and then we hope eventually that more people are going to get engaged, and either they do other things later on, or they don't, but both are still valid. But yeah, what are the benefits of the movement? I guess why do you think donations in particular is useful for the animal movement, and yeah, why focus on that?
As well as I think being an effective and easy thing for individuals to do. What's great about this is actually asking people for donations, if it's successful, solves one of the biggest problems we have in the movement. Estimates are that our movement for ending factory farming has about less than $300 million globally, which means that we have about as much money roughly as McDonald's makes in a week of profits. to spend to help 80 billion land animals, trillions of crustaceans and fish as well, which is obviously nowhere near enough money. The ASPCA alone has more money than we do. So this is a real kind of David and Goliath fight. In fact, the meat industry is worth $2 trillion, which means that if it was David and Goliath, because we're nerds and we worked this out, it would Goliaths would be so tall that the Earth's atmosphere would reach up to about his belly button. That's the kind of scale difference between the animal movement and the meat industry here. We clearly have demonstrated with campaigns like some of the corporate campaigns that have been going on, the work that's been doing on cultivated meat, that we can still win against this Goliath. We can still improve the lives of animals. And what we really need is more money, both to scale up these interventions that we know work around the world, particularly in parts of the world where factory farming is growing fastest and there are the least protections for animals, but also then to explore more potentially really exciting interventions. You go to any animal conference and you speak to so many people with really interesting ideas, creative ideas, new ways they want to try to help. And the big reason it's not happening is because there just isn't enough money to fund every potentially promising thing. And so by focusing on trying to activate the public through donations, we can also solve one of the biggest problems that we have in the movement, which is the lack of resource to try everything and to do everything that we think can be good and that we know can work.
Nice. Yeah, I heard this comparison recently, kind of similar to what you're saying, from Lewis Bollard on, like, if you thought about how much money we had to help every animal on Earth, it's like per hen we have like less like 0.01 cents. And then if you go to like shrimp, we have like 1 cent for every 1,000 shrimp we want to try to help. So it's like, yeah, if you actually put it in kind of different framings, and the Goliath height one is interesting. Yeah, you just see how little money we have.
A lot of what we're talking about isn't kind of groundbreaking in the sense of like no one's ever thought that we need money before or something like this. I think the thing is, when I talk to people in the movement, they often agree in principle, but that actually the trick is to actually then go and do the thing. So I think particularly this diet change is a big one of these, right? Where lots of people will agree, yeah, it would be great if more non-vegans were involved in the movement by donating or volunteering or whatever. But then you actually have to take the further step of like changing the way that you communicate and changing who you're communicating to and really doing the thing. And that's where things often start to kind of come off the rails, right? Where the ick factor starts to come in for people and they're like, oh, yeah, but I don't really want to ask people to like offset, because isn't that just like paying to not feel guilty anymore or whatever it might be, right? And so I think this is not so much a conceptually complicated thing. It's an emotionally complicated thing sometimes to really do the thing.
Yeah, I think that's true probably in the case of offsets, but I can't, I imagine that most of the large animal advocacy groups, or even the small ones, they want donations and they probably don't care who it comes from. They're not going to do like something like survey of like your diet as you try to donate. So like they probably are, in some way doing this by soliciting donations from people who just care about animals. So I guess, yeah, my sense is maybe it's already happening, but yeah, maybe when you overlay the offset framing, then it feels a bit more quid pro quo.
So I think that's right. I don't think people are throwing money away if it comes from someone who occasionally eats a cheeseburger or whatever. But I think that ACE, Animal Charity Evaluators, did some recent research into kind of why people donate and what some of their reasons for not wanting to donate or their hesitations might be. And a big one of those was worrying about how kind of activisty, or whether their money is going to support sort of animal activism, whatever that means. And I think it's a sense that what donors want is someone to meet them where they are. And I think that's where it gets tricky. It's not that people wouldn't take their money. It's that you have to really think about what the person who you're asking for money, what their motivations, what their values are. And like effective altruists get this wrong in that we want to show them lots of spreadsheets and be like, this is the reason why this is good, because the numbers, see all these lovely numbers. And really what people want is to be engaged at the level of their values and their emotions, and they want to feel through that, and their donations are part of a way of like feeling that you are expressing your empathy as well, right? But then I think also other parts of the movement can get this wrong by talking about things like, for example, framing animals in terms of their rights rather than in terms of protecting animals. And these kinds of ways of framing the questions are not things that everyone is on board with, actually. And if we want to create this broad movement, we have to meet people where they are. And that can mean actually having to change what we're talking about and how we talk about those things as well.
Mm. And do you have any kind of research evidence that kind of backs up some of the stuff you're saying on maybe why donation appeal is a promising approach?
We obviously don't want to just sort of hypothesize from an armchair about why we think donation is better. So we worked with an organization called Rethink Priorities, and they run kind of regular surveys and studies. And we were able to get some questions into one of their studies on specifically on this. So what we did was we put in front of people a message around changing their diets, and we put in front of a message to people about donating. And we also then actually, with our donation message, we both kind of directly contrasted it with diet change and just sort of didn't mention diet change at all. And we were looking to see which of these did people find compelling, like what do people find believable and are motivated by. And what we found was that both the donation message itself was more compelling to people, statistically significantly compelling. And I think particularly it was more compelling with a wider group of people than the diet message. So the people who responded to the diet message more conform to what we think is traditional animal supporters, and whereas the kind of this donation message seems to have broad appeal with people, which is quite exciting. So that provided us with some actual, at least initial data to suggest that this is a promising way to go. Obviously, the caveats that asking people in the survey is different from them actually putting their money down. We would like to look at this further and try some both kind of in the real world with our actual work, but also maybe in some more kind of research, try to really get closer to the real thing. But I think this provides some promising evidence that this is at least an area worth exploring.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. The fact that this kind of confirms some intuitions and hunches and some other research that existed maybe in non-animal domains, I think is, yeah, definitely a pretty indicator that it's worth exploring. So yeah, it's very cool that you and Rethink Priorities found this. Do you have any more practical things of like, a group that's doing outreach, you're not asking someone to change their diet, you're asking someone to make a donation to an animal, like an effective animal charity. What are some other things that are like quite like tangible, practical things that people might do if they kind of believe this?
In terms of what things we might ask people to do, or
No, like more like what advocacy organizations might do. What people like what you said. It's maybe you're framing animals in a certain way. Maybe your asks in a certain thing. Anything else that comes to mind there?
I think there are some things that we should be exploring. Rutger Bregman, in his latest book, Moral Ambition, tells this great story, really interesting story about the origins of the anti-slavery movement in the UK. And initially, it's this kind of ragtag group of people mainly in the UK who really believe slavery is wrong, and they can get no one to listen to them. And one of the kind of breakthroughs, at least as he tells it, is saying, okay, most people don't care about the slaves, but what they do care about is the British sailors on the slave boats, and their lives when they're on these boats are actually really terrible. Like, loads of them die because actually there's as the captain of the slave boat, there's kind of an incentive to get as many of the slaves to the destination as possible, because they're your product, as it were. You're going to make money from selling them. But the sailors, they're just a cost to you because you have to pay them if they get to the other end. So there's very little incentive to keep them alive. And actually, kind of horrible as it sounds to us now, but sympathy for these sailors on the slave boats was initially the hook that the anti-slavery movement was able to use to build broader public support. This, I think, is a kind of fascinating story, and I think about a lot, like, what are our versions of this? And talking more about what it's like to be a slaughterhouse worker or a factory farm worker. Like, slaughterhouse working is one of the most dangerous jobs, for example, in the United States. They are done overwhelmingly by people in very disadvantaged positions. Maybe they are migrants, maybe they are people coming out of prisons, people who can't get any other job because there's basically no reason you would want to do this job if you had any other choice. So I think that's one framing. Another framing, I think, which is much more broad-based, but is around public health. So antibacterial diseases are supposed to be a leading killer by 2050 of people worldwide, according to American health authorities. And we feed 3/4 of our antibiotics currently to animals. It's a massive driver of this problem. It could cause this could put all our lives at danger, from very simple, getting a cut can then become a dangerous thing, as it was hundreds of years ago because of this.
Yeah.
So I think some of these framings that are not about necessarily about the animals, not about the thing that we really, really care about here, which is animal suffering, but are ways to connect the issue to things that a broader range of people can also identify as things that they really care about. I think we're doing a reasonably good job about this on the climate, for example. Lots of people talk about animals in terms of the climate, but there are other of these kind of hooks that we could be doing more with, I think, to sort of engage more people with this issue.
I guess my hunch is that I think people caring about, factory farming for the reason of animal welfare will lead to better outcomes, whatever that means. I.e., they'll understand that actually what happens to chickens is vastly more important than what happens to cows, even though the climate impacts of these are maybe kind of flipped. So I guess, like, for example, with the caring about the sailors on these slave ships example, like, do you know if, maybe this is a tough question, like, did they develop, empathy for the actual slaves after developing empathy for the sailors, or was it purely instrumental, like, okay, we should abolish this for them, and then maybe a different group of people started caring about the actual slaves?
My understanding is that sort of it was more sort of a bit of a kind of moral circle expansion thing, where people started to care more and more about the issue intrinsically over time in Britain, and the government sort of started to take it more seriously holistically eventually. But you needed, one of the things I think is true, and I think this is true of the animal movement, is in the world there are almost arbitrarily some issues that you're allowed to sort of regard as serious. So this is really important in like the media and politics, where one of the things that comes across in the research of animal donors is sometimes animal donors actually feel a little bit silly for caring about animals, because
Yeah.
there's a perception that it's fundamentally somehow unserious to care about animals. But there are these topics. Climate, I think, is one of them now. Like, acceptable to care about. It's like it's serious to take this, to care about the climate, the economy, public health, these kinds of things. And so I think, like, sometimes to allow people to start listening to you, you need to hook into the thing that, like, is within the Overton window.
Yeah, yeah. Any rough thoughts on how to make animals stuff more serious? Is that just that you think it's tying it into current serious issues until eventually it becomes its own one?
I think so. I think it's starting with the things that people already. A general good piece of advice on trying to kind of win people over or get them or persuade them is, you can't persuade them that they're wrong. You have to always tell them why they were right all along to agree with you. And so you're trying to find the things that they already believe in, they already care about, and show them why this is part of that thing.
So pressing on to farm kind, I guess some of the ways you try to implement this in the real world. So you guys have done a series of essentially tests of, first there's a more of a giving multiplier calculator, then now you have the compassion calculator, and then I'm sure you've done plenty of other stuff besides that. Can you just maybe expand on, some of these tests you ran, maybe first the multiplier and how that went for you?
Yeah, sure. So we kind of try and think of ourselves a little bit like almost like a startup, in that what we're trying to do is explore different territory to find kind of our product market fit. The thing that we can build that has a market for it, and that ultimately leads to more money for amazing charities doing great work to help animals. And so the kind of place we started with this was 97 or 95%, excuse me, of donations currently go in the animal space go to dogs and cats. So like the 800 million or so dogs and cats and other pets get the vast majority of the donations. What if we could get people who donate to those to also donate to farmed animals? And there is this research primarily by Dr. Joshua Green and Lucius Caviola, where they did this sort of donation splitting thing with mainly with sort of just any charities, where like basically you split between your favorite charity and like a really effective charity, and this encouraged people to donate more to these really effective charities. And we thought, let's do that for farmed animals. So we'll have people split their favorite dogs and cats charity and these really effective farmed animal charities, and like farmed animals will get more money. This basically, we think it didn't work for us at all. We think the main reason is because it's just too complicated. We were kind of having to explain to people why they should care about chickens and pigs, and then also explain this slightly more complicated way to give money. So this was like kind of, we pivoted away from this like fairly quickly as an organization.
When you say it wasn't working, you just like, the initial takeoff of donors wasn't that significant, and like you didn't see it growing.
The donors that we had were just basically giving to our kind of like the bonus fund that we used to top up the thing. We also were running into problems where like we were trying to find ways to advertise this in different fields, and it was really hard to like explain this in a way that people like quickly in a way that people thought made sense.
Surely the giving multiply people were like, they're doing an okay job, right? I guess like
Yeah, they're doing a great job.
I guess you kind of said, maybe there's the additional thing of like you have to also convince them like why farmed animals, but like why do you think it was harder for you to cut through and not necessarily for them?
Yeah, so I think there are two things. I think one is we're having to explain two things to you, like how this thing works and also how to use it. I think the other piece to this is that they also have a really great way for them to talk about this is the research they did in the lab. So these are Harvard psychologists who did this amazing research, and they've got a really great story to tell. And obviously, we were just taking their work and trying to do it again, and so we don't have that same story to tell.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense. So you killed the multiplier effort. What did you do next? Was that the compassion calculator?
Yeah, so we initially built the compassion calculator just essentially as a gimmick, just to sort of we had all this data on how effective our charities were, and we were like, oh, you could just compare these to like how what people eat, and that'd be fun, wouldn't it? And then we started talking to people about it, and we could see very quickly that people were excited by this and they were switched on, and in a way that they weren't by the sort of split and boost idea that we had, the kind of giving multiplier style thing. And so we were like, okay, there seems to be something in that, and we sort of it's that our organization been a story of kind of in gradually pivoting more and more, like focusing more and more of our energies on this thing as we've kind of found more like, that people are excited by it and that they want to use it, and it seems to be solving a problem for them.
Yeah, I think I think PromKind is an interesting example to me at least of like an organization who's very willing to experiment and then kind of kill programs that aren't working. And most people don't like shutting down programs. But maybe can you say more about like the philosophy of why I guess you want to just try a bunch of stuff and just like cut things that don't work and be a bit more ruthless than most?
Yeah, so I think we have an advantage, right? Where our success metric is really easy to see. Our success metric is, are we raising money for charities? And other charities, it can be a little bit more, it can be a little bit less clear. It can take longer to understand. Feedback loops can be longer. M&E is harder, that kind of thing. We are pretty relentlessly focused. We on trying to in trying to achieve our mission and do as much good as we can. And really, we are sort of relentlessly trying to stop ourselves from falling foul of sort of the sunk cost fallacy, and also realizing that we're trying to break ground. The way we think about what we're trying to do is find new ways to raise money. So the movement there is lots of understanding of how to raise money in the movement. There are people whose that's their job. They've been doing it for a really long time. They're really good at it, and they have particular ways of doing it. We are trying to find new ways to raise new money from new kinds of donors, and so we really see this as like exploring new territory. And when you're exploring new territory, you have to place lots and lots of bets, and then you have to really know when to fold as well, because
Yeah,
we're a small team. It's currently me and my co-founder, so we can't be doing 70 things at once. We have to be really good at finding the things that are where things are starting to where there's a positive signal, and then really doubling down on those things.
nice. And I mean this is true both for your programs, but also your organization. I think in the last insider update, I think I can share this is like you guys are going to have a reevaluation period for FormKind as an organization in coming up, and at that point, maybe you'll decide whether you either double down on the compassion calculates, maybe you pivot to another approach, or you'll shut down entirely. And I guess it's not often you see that third option is actually on the table. So I don't know if you want to, I guess, share a bit more about that.
Yeah, we've always felt that like we need to justify our existence, and if we felt that we were not actually overall producing, not just raising some money for the movement, but also doing more with all the resources, that means the people, the talent that we have, that with FarmKind, if we could take those resources, those talents, and put them somewhere else and do more with that, we should do that instead. And so we're not, neither me nor Aiden are wedded to like, just because we founded FarmKind doesn't mean we can't go off and go work for somebody else if we think that would be ultimately more impactful for farmed animals. And so we're always kind of reassessing, like, is this working enough now to justify us carrying on? And would we be having more impact if we went somewhere else?
Nice. Yeah, I think it's very refreshing and important, like, sense of humility to have in terms of, yeah, like, what else you could be doing, and like, is this the best use of funds? Have you guys got other potential plans in mind for if the capacity calculator doesn't work? Do you have other avenues you're currently exploring that might be like new ways to raise money?
There's still, I think, a bunch of unexplored stuff. I think particularly and I don't know if Aiden and I are necessarily the best people for this, but there is definitely some stuff around those kind of like dogs and cats donors. Like, we tried the giving multiplier thing, but I still think there's a lot of potential in those kinds of donors. There's a lot of advantages there, in that we already know that they have a propensity to donate to animal charities. We've got a pretty good idea of who they are for that reason as well, and it's like a pretty large market. So more to be explored in that space. We're also really enjoying at the moment. We are kind of building our kind of networks and our engagement with sort of the world of podcasting and Substack. We recently launched our own podcast. This has been a great opportunity to get to know other people and things like this. So we're quite interested also in sort of how kind of these sort of parasocial relationships can open up opportunities for donating. I think what's more powerful than somebody you trust and that you have a kind of relationship with you, recommending you donate to this THL or whatever it might be. This is a kind of strategy for raising money that I think is really exciting, and something that
Nice.
we'd be interested in trying more of.
That's exciting. Yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend the podcast. Changed my mind, not because I was on it recently, but because it's actually good, and it's an important topic. And changing your mind, what's not to love? Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that the companion animal donors is an interesting market that I think no, at least not that I know of, that no one has really successfully kind of like, tapped into, so to speak. And there's been lots of discussion around, how do we reach climate funders and climate philanthropy, whereas you think there's another very sympathetic audience kind of sitting on our doorstep. And I think the interesting thing you guys did recently was you did this puppy parade and this kindness
Yeah.
animals pledge. So you guys are trying to
Yeah.
try out some things and make some inroads, but I guess you found it hasn't been the easiest kind of takeoff.
Yeah, I think the problem with this audience is that if you're not just going to serve them digital adverts, which is one way you can try and do things, it's really hard to know like where they hang out. What you want generally when you're marketing a thing where you're trying to fundraise is to find like a really high concentration of the kind of people who are your sort of your audience, and then
Yeah.
go there and show them your thing. And with your typical kind of animal charity donor, that's just a bit harder because they tend to be they tend to be a little bit older and female and things like this, and they are generally less on social media than
Mm.
some other age groups. Not going to be necessarily listening to podcasts and things. They're more traditional media, which are like really hard environments for small organizations to kind of get into. And
Yeah.
it's hard to get into the newspaper, on TV, and that sort of stuff. And so there are some challenges here with this audience, but I think it's a high potential audience if someone can find kind of the right way to crack it. We've been experimenting with a few things, but we definitely haven't made it sort of there yet.
I mean, I think something we haven't spoken about so far is I think I was very impressed. You've crossed the 100K mark for donations raised, I think, since your lifespan, which is not more than a year. And I guess the more impressive thing to me is you more or less averaged 10K in monthly donations for the last like 6 months, which for me seems huge. So yeah, I guess, do you want to share on like, do you feel like you've had like a bit of an inflection point and things are speeding up relative to how they were previously?
Yeah, so we've been fundraising now for 10 months roughly, and we have raised just over $100,000. So that's great, and the sort of trend line is going in the right direction. We're also really pleased that about 40% of our donors overall are repeat monthly donors, which is also, I think, a
Nice.
really healthy sign for our total fundraising. It's funny when you're building something like this, you feel kind of like every day that you don't see like a new donation come in or a new donor come in, it's like, oh, we didn't do anything, like we didn't achieve anything. But when you take a step back, yeah, I think we're like reasonably happy with how we did. I think we kind of came in with these really like high expectations of how quickly we would be able to fundraise, and we haven't quite met those. But yeah, things are definitely moving in the right direction, and I think there's a lot of positive signs that what we're doing is working, and what we need is that kind of, we really need that big moment to kind of like really sort of take off and get to the next level, I think.
I've seen a bunch of project plans and goals for the year, and I think a recurring symptom is people have very ambitious goals, and it's actually very hard to achieve those
Yeah,
things. So I think this planning fallacy is very ingrained and very hard to shake off, and especially people who are like
yeah.
optimistic and ambitious. Oh, I want to do big things, and it's actually hit the real world, and not everything goes to plan.
Yeah, I think I one of the biggest learnings in our first sort of 6 months was to do less. We kind of tried to do every channel all at once, all at the same time, and that was like clearly wrong. And what we've done is we've kind of narrowed our focus, both in terms of our audience and what we're trying to do, but also in terms of how we try to reach them. And that has allowed us to do a few things really well, rather than like lots of things averagely. And that's been a real game changer for us, for sure.
Nice, yeah. Focus is forever important, and I know how hard you and Aiden work, so I'm sure you guys not doing much, still you guys doing quite a lot. To round things up, what's one bit of news you're excited to hear or grateful about recently?
Yeah, so I was recently at the AI and Animals conference. It was a really fascinating conference here in London, where Jonathan Birch, who's a LSE philosopher who does some amazing work on animal sentience and helped to get crustaceans into the decapods into the Animal Sentience Act in the UK, and he's launching a new center for research in the UK on working on animal sentience and some of these questions around things I mentioned at the beginning around precision livestock farming and the sort of the future of how we look after animals. And he's an incredibly fascinating guy, a really effective academic in actually taking his work and like making that into policy. And so I think that's actually a really exciting development in the UK for animals in the future.
Nice, it's very cool. What's some media recommendations you'd have to listeners? It can be books, podcasts, or anything else. And obviously, your own podcast will be mentioned, so you don't have to mention that.
So a great book that is recently out that I definitely would recommend everyone read is Rutger Bregman's Moral Ambition. If you haven't read that yet, it is just a very inspiring call to focusing your life on trying to make the world a better place rather than enriching yourself. And it's beautifully written. Some of the people mentioned in the book I know as well, which is always nice. I was like, oh, I know that guy. So that's always fun. But I would definitely recommend. And another book actually that I really love, Frans de Waal's writing on animals. I think I find it incredibly inspiring and moving, particularly his book Mama's Last Hug, which is all about kind of the emotional complexity of animals. And for us working in this field, I think it really is a nice reminder, I think, of what the stakes are in the work we do, but also I think a great treasure trove also for explaining to people like actually why the experience of animals really matters. And it's got full of brilliant anecdotes that can help us to like communicate just like how complex and emotionally varied these animals are. So those would be two recommendations.
Nice, that's awesome. We'll link them both below. Finally, how can people get more involved in your work? You hiring? Do you need more volunteers? And where can people find you generally?
Yeah, so FarmKind is hiring right now. We are hiring our first hire, which is someone to help us, particularly with growth and outreach. So if you are or know anyone who has experience in marketing, in building networks, in taking either, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be sort of in the animal space, but maybe actually, or maybe ideally some sort of for-profit experience would be great. But have this excitement about our mission and about building a new organization, particularly reaching lots of new people, then please do get in touch. We have an ongoing hiring process that we'd love you to be involved in, and you can find that at our website, which is farmkind.giving, where all our information is, and you can find out about the things we do, the charities we recommend, and all our work there.
Nice. Yeah, we'll definitely link that job below. Yeah, it's an exciting role. And with that, yeah, thank you, Tom, so much for joining. And yeah, I guess this has been a pretty broad conversation from, what should we be asking the public to do to help animals, and all the way to, I guess, organizing puppy parades and giving multiplier pledges and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, thanks for this pretty fun discussion.
Thank you very much. It was great fun.